In the autumn of 1911, when the mountains of the Washington Cascades carried their first silver frost and the rivers roared with melted snow from distant glaciers, the town of Blackpine existed like a forgotten secret hidden beneath endless forests. The town had one muddy road, a church with a leaning steeple, a logging mill that groaned day and night, and a cluster of wooden homes that looked as though the mountains themselves had pushed them into the valley. Most people who arrived in Blackpine did not stay long. The winters were cruel, the isolation unbearable, and the mountains seemed to swallow hope itself. Yet among the people of Blackpine there existed a story whispered in saloons, church pews, and candlelit kitchens. It was the story of Edith Vandermeer. Some called her a miracle. Others called her cursed. And there were a few who believed she was something medicine had no language for. Edith was born during the dead of winter in January of 1893. The storm that night had buried the town beneath 7 feet of snow, and the only doctor in Blackpine had died 3 weeks earlier after falling through frozen river ice. Her mother, Helena Vandermeer, was certain both she and the baby would perish before dawn. The labor lasted nearly 20 hours. By midnight Helena had stopped screaming entirely. Her husband, Thomas Vandermeer, later said the silence frightened him more than the storm. Then something strange happened. The old midwife, Martha Keene, claimed the temperature in the room suddenly rose. Frost melted from the windows. The candles burned brighter. Helena's pulse, which had become weak and fading, returned with unnatural strength. And when the baby finally emerged, she did not cry. She opened her eyes. Martha Keene swore those eyes were not the eyes of a newborn child. They were alert, focused, almost knowing. She looked at me, Martha later whispered years afterward. Like she already understood the world. Within days, rumors spread throughout Blackpine. The child never became sick. Not once. Even during the influenza outbreaks that swept through the valley, Edith remained untouched. While other children coughed blood into cloth and burned with fever, Edith wandered the snowy woods alone without so much as a shiver. At age 4 she began speaking in strangely precise sentences. At 6 she could identify medicinal plants hidden beneath forest moss. At 7 she saved a dying horse by crushing pine needles and bark into a poultice no adult had ever seen before. The horse survived. The owner swore the animal stood within minutes. People started bringing injured animals to the Vandermeer cabin. Edith treated them quietly. And they healed. No one could explain why. Thomas Vandermeer feared the attention. He had arrived in Blackpine years earlier after fleeing Chicago debts and carried with him a deep distrust of strangers. He warned Edith repeatedly. People fear what they cannot understand. But Edith merely listened with distant eyes. By the age of 10, she had read every medical text available within 60 miles. Most were outdated books carried by traveling doctors or abandoned by prospectors. She consumed them obsessively. Yet the stranger thing was this: she often knew things the books did not. One evening a logger arrived at the cabin with a deep infection spreading up his arm after an axe wound. His skin had darkened nearly black. The nearest physician claimed amputation was necessary. Edith examined the wound silently. Then she walked into the forest during a thunderstorm. She returned an hour later carrying a cluster of pale blue fungi growing beneath cedar roots. No one in Blackpine had ever seen them before. She boiled them into liquid and forced the logger to drink. By morning the fever vanished. Within a week the infection disappeared completely. Word spread beyond Blackpine. Travelers began arriving from neighboring settlements. A woman with failing lungs. A child unable to walk. A miner whose spine had been crushed. Some she healed. Some she could not. But even in failure, people noticed something unsettling. Edith always knew who would die. Always. She never explained how. In 1908, when Edith turned 15, a physician named Drive Samuel Reinhardt arrived from Seattle after hearing rumors of the mountain healer girl. Reinhardt was a respected neurologist educated in Boston and Berlin, known for his fierce belief in scientific rationality. He expected superstition. What he found disturbed him. Edith met him outside the Vandermeer cabin wearing a dark wool coat and muddy boots. Her hair was braided loosely, and despite the cold mountain wind she appeared perfectly calm. "You traveled 3 days to prove I'm a fraud," she said before he introduced himself. Reinhardt froze. "I wrote those exact words in my journal," he replied. "I know." He studied her carefully. "Did my father tell you?" "No." "Then how?" Edith tilted her head slightly. "I hear things before people speak them." Reinhardt laughed nervously. "Telepathy." "No. Not thoughts exactly. More like intentions." The doctor remained in Blackpine for 2 weeks. During that time he observed Edith treating patients. She possessed no formal medical training. Yet she understood anatomy with impossible precision. She diagnosed illnesses after touching someone's wrist for only seconds. She predicted seizures before they occurred. She identified internal bleeding without examination. One afternoon Reinhardt secretly switched 2 medicine bottles, convinced she relied on memorization and tricks. Edith stopped before administering the treatment. "You changed them," she said quietly. Reinhardt stared at her. "You saw me." "No. Then how did you know?" Edith looked genuinely confused. "Because the wrong bottle feels louder." The answer haunted him. At night Reinhardt filled pages of notes trying to explain her abilities through emerging theories of neurology and cognition. He considered hyper-observation, heightened sensory processing, instinctive intelligence. But nothing fully fit. The final incident shattered him. A lumber worker collapsed near the mill after suffering a severe cranial injury. Half his skull had been crushed beneath falling timber. Reinhardt examined him and declared the man beyond saving. Edith disagreed. She asked for boiling water, thread, whiskey, and a lantern. For 6 hours she operated inside the Vandermeer cabin while Reinhardt watched in disbelief. She moved with impossible certainty. Her hands never trembled. She removed shattered bone fragments, drained blood pressure from the skull, and stitched damaged tissue with methods Reinhardt had only encountered in experimental European journals. The patient survived. Reinhardt could not sleep afterward. Near dawn he confronted Edith outside beside the frozen river. "Who taught you?" he demanded. "No one." "That's impossible." "Maybe impossible things happen more often than people think." Reinhardt stepped closer. "You are 16 years old. Rural Washington has no surgical schools. No laboratories. No mentors. Yet you perform procedures advanced surgeons barely understand." Edith looked toward the mountains. "When I touch someone," she said softly, "I can feel what's wrong inside them. Sometimes I see it clearly. Sometimes not. You see inside the human body. In a way that cannot exist. Then explain why your left hand shakes every morning." Reinhardt's face drained of color. He had hidden the tremor for years. No one knew. "You damaged the nerve after your accident in Berlin," Edith continued. "You hide it because surgeons don't trust weak hands." Reinhardt stumbled backward. He had never spoken of Berlin to anyone in Blackpine. The next morning he left town without explanation. Reinhardt could not sleep that night. The rain hammered against the cabin roof while Edith's words echoed endlessly inside his mind. He sat beside the lantern writing notes with trembling hands. By dawn, he packed his belongings quietly. Thomas Vandermeer watched him saddle his horse outside. "You're leaving already?" Thomas asked. Reinhardt avoided his eyes. "I came here searching for a fraud. I found something far more dangerous." "Dangerous?" The doctor looked toward Edith standing near the tree line. "She knows things she should not know." Thomas lit a cigarette slowly. "Maybe some things in this world aren't meant to be understood." Reinhardt hesitated. "That girl needs protection." "From who?" The doctor mounted his horse. "From people like me." Without another word, he rode into the fog, disappearing down the muddy mountain road. For several weeks life in Blackpine became quiet again. Edith spent most of her time wandering through the forests collecting herbs and strange fungi hidden beneath fallen cedar trees. But the townspeople had changed. They looked at her differently now. Some whispered prayers when she passed. Others crossed the street entirely. One evening a terrified woman arrived at the Vandermeer cabin carrying her young son wrapped in blankets. The boy's skin burned with fever. "He won't wake up," the mother cried. "Please help him." Edith touched the child's forehead and suddenly froze. "What is it?" Helena asked nervously. Edith looked toward the mountains. "There are more." "What do you mean?" "Sick people. Coming here." The next morning 3 more families arrived from neighboring settlements. All carried the same illness. High fever. Bleeding cough. Strange dark marks spreading beneath the skin. Even Edith looked disturbed. "I've never seen this before," she whispered. By the end of the week the sickness had spread through half the valley. Church bells rang constantly for funerals. The logging mill shut down. People locked themselves inside their homes terrified of breathing the cold mountain air. At night Blackpine felt like a dying town. Yet Edith barely slept. She moved from cabin to cabin carrying lantern light through the darkness like a wandering ghost. Sometimes she treated patients for 20 hours without resting. And somehow, she always knew which houses needed her most. One stormy evening Helena found Edith sitting alone beside the river. "You can't save everyone," her mother said softly. Edith stared at the black water silently. "I know. Then why do you keep trying?" Edith's gray eyes filled with tears for the first time in years. "Because when I touch them," she whispered, "I can feel how afraid they are." The next morning, the fog hanging over Blackpine looked thicker than usual. No birds sang in the trees. Even the river sounded quieter, as if the valley itself had become sick. Edith returned home just before sunrise carrying bundles of wet herbs in her arms. Mud covered the bottom of her dress and her hands were stained dark green from crushed plants. Helena rushed toward her immediately. You need rest. There isn't time. You've been awake for 2 days. Edith ignored the comment and walked directly toward the kitchen table where dozens of small glass bottles stood beside boiling water and strips of cloth. Thomas watched silently from the corner. You look pale, he said. Edith stopped for a moment. For the first time, she seemed exhausted. I keep hearing them, she whispered. Hearing who? The sick. Thomas frowned. From the town. Edith slowly shook her head. Farther away. A cold silence filled the room. That afternoon another wagon arrived from the neighboring settlement of Grey Hollow. Inside were 4 infected miners barely able to breathe. One of them grabbed Edith's wrist desperately. She told us to come here, he coughed. Edith looked confused. Who did? The woman in the woods. What woman? The miner pointed weakly toward the mountains. Gray eyes, dark coat. Helena's face turned pale. But Edith said nothing. She spent the next several hours treating the men while rain battered the cabin windows. Outside, fear spread through Blackpine faster than the disease itself. The church became overcrowded with frightened families praying for survival. Store shelves emptied within hours. Some townspeople began carrying rifles, convinced outsiders had brought the sickness intentionally. At sunset, the mayor gathered several men near the mill. We should quarantine the Vandermeer place, one man argued nervously. Every sick traveler keeps ending up there. They go there because she's helping them, another replied. Or because she's causing it. The argument nearly became violent. By nightfall, rumors had consumed the town. Some believed Edith was blessed by God. Others believed she had invited something evil into the valley. Meanwhile, Edith worked in near silence. She mixed strange medicines no doctor recognized. She burned certain roots over boiling water, creating thick bitter smoke that filled the cabin. And somehow the patients who inhaled it began recovering faster. Even Thomas could not explain what he was witnessing. Late that night, a violent knocking shook the front door. Thomas opened it to find Drive Arthur Winslow standing outside, soaked by rain. His face looked terrified. She's getting worse, he said breathlessly. Who? My assistant. The fever reached her lungs. Edith immediately stood. You came all the way from the hotel in this storm? Helena asked. Winslow swallowed hard. She keeps coughing blood. Edith grabbed her coat without hesitation. The streets of Blackpine looked almost abandoned beneath the storm. Lanterns flickered weakly through the fog while distant coughing echoed from houses hidden in darkness. As they walked quickly toward the hotel, Winslow glanced nervously at Edith. How do you stay standing? He asked. You haven't rested in days. I don't feel tired the same way anymore. That isn't normal. Edith looked ahead quietly. I know. When they entered the hotel room, the smell of sickness hit them immediately. Winslow's assistant lay shaking violently beneath sweat-soaked blankets. Blood stained the pillow beneath her mouth. Edith moved closer and suddenly stopped. Her expression changed instantly. What is it? Winslow asked. Edith touched the woman's neck gently. Then she whispered something so softly Winslow almost missed it. It learned. What? The sickness. Winslow stared at her. Diseases don't learn. This one does. The lantern beside the bed flickered strangely. Edith closed her eyes as though listening to something distant. Then she spoke again. It's changing faster now. Winslow felt genuine fear crawl through his chest. You sound like you're talking about a living mind. Edith opened her eyes slowly. Maybe I am. For several seconds neither of them moved. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. Then suddenly the sick woman stopped breathing. Winslow rushed forward in panic. No, but Edith caught his arm. Wait, what are you doing? Edith placed one trembling hand against the woman's chest. The room became unnaturally still. Even the rain outside seemed distant. Winslow felt pressure building inside his ears. Then the woman gasped violently, sucking air back into her lungs. Winslow stumbled backward in horror. The assistant's eyes opened slowly. Alive. Completely alive. Edith, however, nearly collapsed beside the bed. Winslow grabbed her shoulders. Her skin felt freezing cold. What did you just do? He whispered. Edith looked weaker than ever before. I don't know anymore. Back at the cabin, Helena found Edith sitting alone beside the fireplace long after midnight. She stared silently into the flames. You saved another one, Helena said softly. Edith did not answer. Edith. Finally the girl spoke. Every time I heal someone, I lose something. Helena's heartbeat quickened. What do you lose? Edith's eyes remained fixed on the fire. Pieces of myself. A deep fear settled over Helena then. Not fear of disease. Not fear of death. Fear of what her daughter was slowly becoming. The following morning Blackpine awoke beneath a sky the color of ash. Thick clouds pressed low over the mountains, trapping the town beneath a heavy silence that felt almost unnatural. Smoke drifted weakly from chimneys, but few people walked the streets anymore. Doors remained locked. Curtains stayed shut. Every family feared the same knock in the night, bringing news that another relative had fallen sick. Inside the Vandermeer cabin, the air smelled of herbs, boiled water, and exhaustion. Empty medicine bottles covered the table beside blood-stained cloths stacked in buckets near the stove. Helena had stopped trying to clean everything hours ago. There were too many patients and too little time. Edith stood near the window watching the forest. Her eyes looked distant again. Thomas noticed immediately. You haven't spoken for nearly an hour, he said carefully. Edith did not turn around. They're coming. Thomas frowned. Who? Before she could answer, horses suddenly approached outside at full speed. Seconds later, loud knocking shook the front door hard enough to rattle the walls. Thomas opened it to find 3 terrified men carrying a woman between them. She looked barely conscious. Her breathing came in wet, painful gasps while dark veins spread visibly along her neck. Please, one of the men begged. Nobody else will help her. Edith moved toward them instantly but froze the moment she touched the woman's wrist. A sharp pain shot through her head so violently she nearly lost balance. Helena rushed forward. Edith. The room blurred around her for several seconds. Then images flooded her mind. Crowded hospitals. Rows of dying people. Doctors covered in blood. Cities she had never seen. And beneath all of it, coughing. Endless coughing. Edith pulled her hand away, breathing hard. Thomas grabbed her shoulder. What happened? But Edith looked terrified for the first time in years. This isn't staying here, she whispered. Nobody understood what she meant. The sick woman suddenly began convulsing violently on the floor. One of the men panicked and backed away while another started praying under his breath. Edith knelt beside the woman quickly. Boiling water, she ordered. And whiskey. Helena hurried toward the stove. Winslow arrived moments later, soaked from rain, carrying a leather medical case beneath his arm. He looked exhausted and unshaven, as though he had not slept in days. I heard another patient arrived, he said breathlessly. Then he saw the woman. His face immediately darkened. My God, what? Thomas demanded. Winslow slowly removed his glasses. This infection shouldn't progress this fast. Edith ignored them both and began crushing herbs into steaming water with mechanical focus. Yet Winslow noticed something disturbing immediately. Her hands were shaking. Not slightly. Violently. You need rest, he said quietly. Edith kept working. If I stop, people die. You're in no condition to continue. Finally she looked up at him. Dark circles surrounded her gray eyes now. Her skin looked almost translucent beneath the lantern light. I said, she whispered coldly, if I stop, people die. Winslow fell silent. For the next 2 hours the cabin became chaos. Patients arrived one after another until every room overflowed with feverish bodies. Some cried in pain. Others lay completely silent, staring blankly at the ceiling. Children coughed blood into towels while frightened parents begged Edith for miracles she could no longer promise. And through all of it, Edith kept moving. From room to room, bed to bed, patient to patient, like someone running from an invisible clock only she could hear ticking. At one point Helena grabbed her arm desperately. You need to eat something. I'm not hungry. You haven't eaten since yesterday morning. Edith blinked slowly as though trying to remember what hunger even felt like. Then, she quietly pulled away. Near midnight the storm outside worsened. Wind screamed through the valley, shaking trees violently while rain hammered the rooftops without mercy. The power generator near the logging mill finally failed, plunging most of Blackpine into darkness. Only lanterns remained. The town looked like a dying world illuminated by weak golden light. Inside the cabin, Winslow sat beside a young boy whose breathing had nearly stopped. Sweat rolled down the doctor's face as he checked the child's pulse repeatedly. He's fading, Winslow muttered. Edith crossed the room immediately. The moment she touched the boy's chest, another wave of pain struck her mind. This time the vision became clearer. She saw enormous crowds wearing masks over their faces. Military trucks filled with bodies. Mass graves. Entire cities silenced by sickness. And somewhere far away, church bells ringing endlessly beneath black skies. Edith staggered backward. Winslow caught her before she fell. What's happening to you? He demanded. Her breathing became uneven. I can see it spreading. What spreading? The future. The words chilled everyone in the room. Thomas stepped closer carefully. Edith, what are you seeing? For several long seconds she could not answer. Then tears slowly filled her eyes. So many dead. Silence swallowed the cabin. Even the storm outside suddenly felt distant. Winslow stared at her in disbelief. You're delirious. No. Edith looked toward him weakly. I wish I was. Then suddenly the boy on the bed stopped breathing completely. Helena gasped. The child's mother collapsed screaming beside the bed. Winslow immediately began chest compressions, but his expression already showed hopelessness. There's no pulse. The mother grabbed Edith desperately. Please, please don't let him die. Edith looked frozen, terrified, not of the disease, not of failure, but of herself. Her trembling hand slowly reached toward the boy's chest. Thomas stepped forward immediately. Edith, stop. She looked at him. For the first time since childhood, her father saw genuine fear inside her eyes. I don't know what happens when I do this anymore, she whispered. The room fell completely silent. Rain pounded against the windows. Lantern flames flickered strangely again. Winslow stared at her, breathing hard. What do you mean? Edith swallowed slowly. Every time I pull someone back, something follows me back. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Then the dead boy suddenly inhaled sharply before Edith touched him at all. The entire room recoiled in horror. The child's eyes opened wide. Alive. But Edith screamed. A violent, unbearable scream unlike anything anyone had heard before. She collapsed onto the floor, clutching her head, while every lantern in the cabin exploded simultaneously into darkness. Darkness swallowed the cabin completely. For several terrifying seconds nobody moved. The only sounds were the storm outside and Edith screaming on the floor as though something invisible were tearing through her mind. Helena dropped to her knees beside her daughter immediately, trying to pull her hands away from her face, but Edith resisted violently. Don't touch me, she cried. Her voice no longer sounded normal. It echoed strangely through the room, deeper somehow, layered with something that made the air itself feel colder. Thomas quickly relit one of the fallen lanterns with shaking hands. Weak golden light returned to the cabin, revealing overturned chairs, shattered glass, frightened patients, and Edith curled against the wooden floor, trembling uncontrollably. The boy who had supposedly died sat upright in bed, gasping for air. Alive. Completely alive. His mother burst into tears and pulled him against her chest while others in the room stared at Edith with growing terror. Nobody spoke. Nobody knew what to say anymore. Winslow slowly approached Edith as cautiously as one would approach a wounded animal. Edith. She did not answer. Blood trickled slowly from her nose onto the floorboards beneath her. Winslow knelt beside her carefully. Can you hear me? Finally she looked up, and Winslow immediately felt fear crawl through his entire body. Her gray eyes looked different. Not physically different, but deeper, older, as though something behind them had awakened. She's here, Edith whispered. Winslow frowned. Who? Edith looked toward the dark window beside the fireplace. The woman from my dreams. Helena held Edith's shoulders tighter. There's nobody outside. Yes, there is. Thomas grabbed the rifle hanging near the front door and stepped outside into the storm despite Helena begging him not to. Rain slammed against him instantly. The entire town looked drowned beneath darkness and fog. Wind howled through the trees while distant lanterns flickered weakly across Blackpine. At first he saw nothing. Then lightning flashed across the valley. And for the briefest moment Thomas noticed a figure standing near the tree line beyond the road. A woman, tall, still, watching the cabin. Another flash of lightning illuminated the forest. The figure was gone. Thomas felt ice spread through his chest. He rushed back inside, immediately locking the door behind him. There was someone out there, he said breathlessly. Winslow stared at him. Who? I couldn't see clearly. Edith slowly sat upright. Yes, you could. Everyone turned toward her. She looked exhausted now, almost fragile again, but her eyes remained unsettlingly calm. She's been following me since I was a child, Edith whispered. Helena looked horrified. What are you talking about? I used to think she was only part of the dreams. Thomas stepped closer. Edith. Who is she? For a long moment Edith remained silent, staring into the lantern flame. Then she spoke softly. I think she's what happens to people like me. The room became deathly still. Winslow tried forcing rationality into his voice. You're exhausted and hallucinating. Edith looked at him weakly. You still want everything to fit inside reason. Because reason is all we have. No, Edith whispered. It's only all you trust. Another coughing fit suddenly erupted from the back room. Helena rushed toward the patients while Winslow followed quickly carrying fresh bandages and medicine. But Edith remained where she was, staring toward the window again. Thomas sat beside her quietly. For the first time in years, he looked afraid of his own daughter. "You need to tell me the truth," he said. Edith's expression tightened. "I don't know the truth anymore." "Then tell me what you do know." Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains like distant cannon fire. Edith finally spoke. "When I was little, I started hearing things before they happened. Small things at first. A horse breaking its leg. Storms arriving. People getting hurt." She swallowed hard. "Then it became worse." Thomas listened silently. "I began seeing people before I met them. Hearing conversations before they happened. Feeling pain inside strangers before they spoke." Edith looked down at her trembling hands. "And every year it became stronger. You should have told us." "I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Edith looked toward him slowly. "That one day I'd stop feeling human." Thomas could not answer. Because deep down, he already feared that day had arrived. Suddenly loud shouting erupted outside the cabin. Thomas grabbed his rifle immediately and rushed toward the door again. Several townspeople were gathering in the muddy street holding lanterns, axes, and hunting rifles. Their faces looked terrified and angry all at once. Mayor Whitaker stood near the front. "This has gone too far," he shouted. Thomas stepped outside cautiously. "What are you doing here?" "A man died at the church an hour ago." Thomas frowned. "People have been dying for days." Whitaker pointed toward the cabin. "Then why did he sit up breathing after that girl touched him?" A murmur spread through the crowd. "Fear. Pure fear. She's unnatural," someone whispered. Another voice shouted, "My wife said the lanterns exploded by themselves. She brought this sickness here." Thomas raised the rifle slightly. "Watch your mouths." But the crowd kept growing. Rain poured over them while lantern light danced across frightened faces twisted by panic and exhaustion. Then Edith appeared behind Thomas. Barefoot, pale, silent. The entire crowd froze immediately. Even the storm suddenly seemed quieter. Whitaker swallowed nervously, trying to maintain authority. "Edith, people are scared." "I know. You need to explain what's happening." Edith looked at the frightened townspeople one by one. Some she had saved personally. Some owed her their lives. Yet now they stared at her like she was something crawling out of a nightmare. Finally she spoke. "I can help you." A man near the back shouted angrily, "Or curse us." Several others agreed loudly. Thomas stepped protectively in front of Edith, but she gently touched his arm, stopping him. Then she looked back toward the crowd. "When your children were sick," she said quietly, "you begged me to save them." Nobody answered. "When your husbands were dying in the mines, you carried them to my door." Rainwater dripped from her dark hair while thunder echoed across the valley. "I never asked any of you for worship. I never asked for fear." Her voice grew softer. "I only tried to help." An older woman suddenly stepped forward, crying openly. "My daughter died anyway." The words hit Edith harder than any scream. Pain flashed across her face immediately. "I know," she whispered. The woman shook violently. "Then what are you?" No one moved. No one breathed. Even Winslow stood frozen in the doorway behind them. Edith looked toward the mountains beyond the town. Toward the endless dark forests disappearing beneath rain and fog. And for a moment she looked impossibly lonely. Then she answered, "I don't think I was meant to know." For several long moments nobody in Blackpine moved at all. Rain continued pouring from the black sky, running down rooftops, soaking coats, dripping from lantern handles and rifle barrels, yet the entire town felt frozen around Edith Vandermeer's final words. The wind carried smoke from chimneys through the muddy streets while thunder rolled across the Washington Cascades like something ancient waking deep within the mountains. Edith stood barefoot beneath the stormlight, pale and exhausted, facing people she had spent years healing, protecting, and saving. Yet now every face staring back at her carried the same terrible expression, fear struggling against gratitude. Mayor Whitaker slowly lowered the lantern in his hand. "You expect us to believe you don't know what you are?" he asked quietly. Edith's eyes remained fixed on the distant forest. "I stopped understanding it a long time ago." A nervous murmur spread through the crowd again. One of the miners stepped forward aggressively. "My brother died yesterday while you were healing others." Another voice shouted from somewhere near the church ruins. "And people return from death after you touch them." She talks about visions. She knows things nobody told her. She isn't normal. The panic in their voices grew louder with every sentence until the entire muddy street became filled with frightened shouting. Thomas tightened his grip on the rifle. Enough. But the crowd no longer listened. Fear had reached the point where reason could not survive inside it anymore. Winslow stepped outside into the rain, carefully raising both hands. All of you need to calm down. Whitaker glared at him. You're a doctor. Explain this. Winslow opened his mouth, then stopped. Because he could not. Not anymore. He had seen too much himself. The dead boy breathing again. Edith predicting symptoms before they appeared. Patients recovering from conditions that should have killed them. And those eyes, those impossible gray eyes that sometimes looked as though they carried memories far older than the girl herself. Winslow removed his soaked glasses slowly. I can't explain it, he admitted. The crowd reacted instantly. Several people stepped backward in visible fear. Others crossed themselves. A woman near the back began quietly praying under her breath. Whitaker looked horrified. Then God help us. Edith suddenly winced sharply as though struck by invisible pain. Helena rushed toward her. Edith. But Edith barely seemed to hear. Her eyes drifted toward the mountains again. Towards something far beyond the town. Then she whispered softly, they're coming. Thomas grabbed her shoulders. Who's coming? Edith's breathing quickened. The sick. Winslow frowned. There are already sick people here. No. Edith shook her head slowly. More. Lightning exploded across the valley at that exact moment, illuminating the distant tree line beyond Blackpine. And suddenly everyone saw them. Shapes. Dozens of them. Moving through the fog between the trees. The townspeople panicked immediately. Lanterns swung wildly. Someone screamed. Several men raised rifles, thinking strangers were approaching through the storm. But as the figures came closer, the truth became far worse. They were people. Injured people. Sick people. Entire families stumbling through rain and mud from neighboring settlements, carrying blankets, luggage, crying children, and feverish relatives barely able to stand. Word about Edith had spread beyond Blackpine. Now desperate survivors were arriving from every direction, hoping she could save them too. Within minutes the muddy road became overcrowded with terrified refugees coughing violently into blood-stained cloths. Some collapsed before even reaching the cabin. Others begged for medicine through trembling lips. Helena covered her mouth in horror. There are so many. Edith looked completely still, almost numb. A little girl no older than 6 suddenly stumbled toward her through the rain. Her face burned with fever and dark marks spread beneath her skin. Please help my mama, the child whispered weakly before collapsing unconscious in the mud. Edith immediately knelt beside her. The moment their skin touched, another violent wave crashed through Edith's mind. This vision was stronger than anything before. Stronger than pain. Stronger than fear. She saw enormous cities covered in smoke. Ships carrying dying passengers across oceans. Hospitals overflowing beyond capacity. Doctors screaming for supplies. Mass graves stretching endlessly beneath gray skies. Then war. Terrible war. Soldiers coughing blood inside trenches. Entire nations drowning beneath disease and violence together. And through all of it, she kept seeing herself. Walking through crowds of dying strangers who reached toward her desperately. Older. Different. Alone. Edith gasped violently, returning to reality. Blood poured from her nose again. Winslow caught her before she collapsed face first into the mud. Edith. The townspeople recoiled in fear. Her entire body trembled uncontrollably now. Thomas pushed through the crowd immediately. What happened? Edith stared upward into the storm with wide, terrified eyes. It's not stopping. What isn't? The sickness. Rainwater mixed with blood across her lips as she struggled to breathe. It spreads beyond mountains, beyond states. Her voice shook violently. Millions. Winslow stared at her in disbelief. You can't possibly know that. But Edith grabbed his coat suddenly with surprising strength. I saw it. Something in her expression made Winslow's blood turn cold. Because she did not sound uncertain. She sounded terrified. And absolutely convinced. Suddenly one of the sick refugees began convulsing violently near the road. Then another collapsed. Then another. Panic exploded through the crowd. People screamed. Children cried. Several men began dragging the infected away from healthy families while others shouted accusations at Edith. She brought this. She cursed the valley. Stay away from her. Thomas fired his rifle into the air, finally silencing everyone. The gunshot echoed across Blackpine beneath thunder and rain. No one touches my daughter, he roared. But Edith slowly stood on shaking legs. Her soaked hair clung against her face while lantern light reflected strangely inside her eyes. Then she said something that terrified Thomas more than anything else that night. They might be right. Helena stared at her. Edith. I don't know what's happening to me anymore. The wind suddenly intensified violently around the cabin. Lantern flames flickered wildly again. Several windows shattered inward without warning, causing the crowd to scream and scatter backward. Winslow looked around in shock. What the hell was that? Edith pressed trembling hands against her head. The humming sound had returned. Low, deep, unnatural, like distant voices speaking beneath the storm. Then she heard it clearly for the first time. Not outside. Inside her mind. A woman's voice. You cannot keep resisting. Edith froze instantly. Her breathing stopped. The voice sounded calm, ancient, almost gentle. Who are you? Edith whispered aloud unknowingly. The townspeople stared at her in horror. Thomas grabbed her arm. Edith, who are you talking to? But Edith no longer seemed fully aware of Blackpine around her. The voice continued. You were never meant to remain small. Suddenly every lantern in the street extinguished at once. Darkness swallowed the entire town. People screamed immediately. Some began running blindly through the mud. Others dropped to their knees praying. Only lightning illuminated the valley now in violent flashes of white and blue. And in one of those flashes, Winslow saw something standing behind Edith. Not clearly. Not fully human. A tall silhouette shaped like a woman made entirely from shadow and storm. Its hand rested gently against Edith's shoulder. Then darkness returned. Winslow staggered backward in terror. When lightning flashed again, the figure was gone. But Edith remained standing perfectly still in the rain. And when she finally lifted her head toward Blackpine again, even Thomas barely recognized the expression in his daughter's eyes anymore. The storm grew worse after that. Rain flooded the streets of Blackpine until muddy water rushed between buildings like shallow rivers. Horses screamed inside their stables. Loose shutters slammed endlessly against walls. Above the town, the dark mountains of the Cascades vanished completely behind moving curtains of fog and lightning. Yet nobody dared leave, not after what they had just seen. The townspeople stood frozen beneath the rain staring at Edith Vandermeer as though she no longer belonged to the same world they did. Thomas slowly stepped toward his daughter again. Edith. His voice sounded smaller now. Careful. Afraid. Edith turned toward him slowly, almost as if she recognized him only after hearing his voice. Her pale face looked emotionless beneath the stormlight, but her eyes carried something strange inside them now, not cruelty, not anger, but distance. A terrifying distance. Like part of her mind was somewhere else entirely. Helena reached for her trembling hand. Please say something. For several seconds Edith simply stared at her mother. Then quietly, I can hear them. Hear who? Helena whispered. The dying. The words cut through the storm like ice. Winslow stepped forward cautiously. Edith, you need to come inside. But Edith shook her head. They're everywhere now. Another flash of lightning illuminated the valley. And suddenly Edith looked directly toward the far side of town. Toward the old church ruins. Her expression changed instantly. There's a fire. Thomas frowned. What? A second later screaming erupted somewhere beyond the rain. Everyone turned. Orange light suddenly burst upward into the darkness near the church. The storage building beside it had caught fire. Panic exploded again. Several townspeople rushed toward the flames while others grabbed buckets and blankets. Wind spread sparks violently across nearby rooftops, causing more screams to echo through Blackpine. Thomas looked back toward Edith in shock. How did you know that? But Edith was already walking. Not toward safety. Toward the fire. Winslow hurried after her. You can barely stand. The children, Edith whispered. What children? There are children trapped inside. Nobody had told her that. Yet when they reached the burning building moments later, terrified cries could already be heard from inside the smoke. Two young brothers had become trapped after hiding there during the storm. The roof was beginning to collapse. No. Their mother screamed while several men held her back. Please somebody help them. The heat from the flames pushed everyone away from the entrance. Everyone except Edith. Thomas grabbed her arm immediately. You're not going in there. They'll die. So will you. Edith looked at him quietly. Then she said the words Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. I think part of me already did. Before anyone could stop her, Edith pulled free and disappeared into the burning building. The crowd erupted in panic. Winslow cursed under his breath. The roof's about to collapse. Smoke poured from broken windows while flames climbed rapidly through the dry wooden walls. Inside, crashing sounds echoed through the structure, followed by coughing children crying for help somewhere deep within the fire. Minutes felt like hours. Then part of the ceiling collapsed inward. Helena screamed. She's still inside. Thomas moved toward the entrance, but Winslow grabbed him violently. You can't go in there. I'm not leaving her. Another explosion of sparks burst through the roof. The entire building groaned. Then suddenly, everything went silent. No screams. No movement. Nothing. Several townspeople lowered their heads, believing Edith was dead. But then lightning flashed across the valley again. And through the smoke, a figure appeared. Walking slowly out of the flames, Edith emerged carrying one unconscious child in her arms while the other stumbled beside her holding tightly onto her coat. The crowd gasped in disbelief. Her dress had burned at the edges. Ash covered her skin, yet somehow the fire itself never seemed to touch her. Thomas rushed forward taking the children immediately while Helena wrapped Edith in blankets. But the moment the adrenaline faded, Edith collapsed. Completely unconscious. Back at the cabin, Winslow worked frantically beside the bed while thunder continued shaking the valley outside. Edith's pulse faded in and out unpredictably. Sometimes it nearly vanished altogether before suddenly returning stronger than before. It doesn't make sense, Winslow muttered repeatedly. Thomas paced near the fireplace unable to stay still. Will she survive? I don't know. You're a doctor. Winslow slammed a blood-stained cloth onto the table in frustration. And nothing about this girl follows medicine. Silence filled the room after that. Only Edith's uneven breathing remained. Hours passed. Near dawn Helena finally fell asleep beside the bed holding Edith's hand. Thomas stood near the window staring into the storm-dark forest outside. Then he noticed something moving between the trees again. The woman, standing perfectly still beyond the edge of town, watching the cabin. Thomas grabbed the rifle immediately and stormed outside into the rain. You stay away from her, he shouted. The figure did not move. Thomas raised the rifle with shaking hands. Who are you? Lightning flashed. For the briefest second he saw her clearly. She looked almost identical to Edith. Only older. Far older. Gray eyes. Dark hair moving in the wind. And an expression filled with unbearable sadness. Thomas froze. The woman spoke softly, yet somehow he heard her clearly beneath the storm. She cannot remain here much longer. Thomas stepped backward in shock. What are you? The woman ignored the question. The more she uses her gift, the less human she becomes. Fear gripped Thomas so hard he could barely breathe. You're lying. I wish I was. The woman slowly looked toward the cabin window where Edith lay unconscious inside. She stands between humanity and things it is not ready to survive. Thomas tightened his grip on the rifle. Stay away from my daughter. The woman's expression softened painfully. She was never only your daughter. Then lightning exploded overhead so brightly Thomas covered his eyes. And when the darkness returned, the woman was gone.